Right after I dropped out of high school and moved out of my parents' house, I needed to work real bad. I'd have done pretty much anything for rent money about that time in my life. So I'm lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, that the local cemetery needed employees. At first, the old-timers who had been working there for 20 or 30 years just wondered why someone so young would ever want to be a grave digger. It was hard work, really bad on the lower back, but I soon adjusted, and it turned out to be something more akin to a free gym membership than an actual job. I mean, I got swole pretty fast. And if I'm honest, it only ever felt like work if the weather was bad, or we had an actual funeral on site. Otherwise, it was just nice to be able to spend time outdoors. So the way our cemetery was set up was pretty simple. The majority of the grounds were just regular grave sites, all pretty much the same size and same price. But the northwest corner of the grounds was a private site that contained much larger plots. These were reserved for much wealthier families, and the local undertaker made a lot of cash from selling extravagant grave setups to them. I'm talking whole mycelium, statues of angels and stuff like that. We hardly ever visited that area of the site to separate cleaning and maintenance duties. And those were never left to me. I didn't take it personally. But the older guys just didn't trust me with all the cleaning chemicals and whatnot that kept the marble and brass fixtures looking fresh. Which is why it was so weird. When I got a call one of my days off, asking me if I'd been up to that area recently, my boss was livid. I could hear it in his voice. And he pulled no punches when he asked me if I had been screwing around on the northwest plots. Of course, I told him now that the last time I had been up there was to watch one of the old-timers using the marble cleaning chemical as part of my training. And that had been months back. He seemed confused and confounded. So I asked him what exactly the issue was. He replied that it could wait until the next time I was at work. I was worried, sure. But I was pretty sure that I hadn't done anything wrong. Not deliberately anyway, and especially nothing that involved the northwest plots. A couple of days later, when I rolled into work, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. I knew something fairly serious had happened. All I knew is that I wouldn't have to badger anyone to find out why the boss man walked me out to the northwest plot silent the whole way. And I knew better than to open my mouth until I found out exactly what was going on. There was already a worker up in the plot tending to one of the graves. And that's when my boss told me that if I had been hanging around the area, maybe during my lunch break, eating a few snacks among the opulent grave sites, now would be the time to tell them. I swear to God that I hadn't, that I knew better than to eat stuff near the graves, as I had been well informed that attracts wild animals that can in turn do damage to some of the resting places. And that's when he broke it down for me. Something had tried to dig up one of the freshly dug graves out in the northwest plots. He said something in particular, and not someone, because we each had enough experience to recognize when a grave had been dug up by tools, or by hand, or in this case, by claw. It was rough around the edges, obvious claw marks, and the dirt was supposed to the straight lines carved out by a shovel. This was something in an emergency. I mean, for obvious sanitary reasons, but for sentimental reasons, to have local families discovered that wild animals were trying to dig up their deceased relatives. That would be an uproar. Something had to be done, and quickly. A meeting was called among the grave diggers in attendance. As far as we knew, the mysterious digging had been taking place overnight, and was most likely undertaken by some kind of scavenger animal, a coyote, black bear, maybe even an escaped dog. The solution was obvious: night watchmen would have to be present in the cemetery every night until the situation was resolved. And guess who was voluntold to be the night watchman for the first full week? You guessed it, the young guy, the new guy, me. The only thing that made the proposal even vaguely attractive was the fact that anyone doing the night work would be paid double the regular rate, and I could definitely have done with the extra cash. First night being on watch really sucked. All I had for company was a flask of strong coffee and a .22 pellet gun loaned to me and by one of the other workers to take down in environments. It was long, boring, and lonely. But once I adjusted my sleeping pattern, it got a little easier. Then, on the second to last night in my watchman duties, I was on a little foot patrol walking towards the northwest plot with a flashlight in my hand. And that's when I saw it. A flurry of frantic limbs digging at the earth. I could have shouted something, maybe even fired the .22 in the air, to scare the animal away. But if I killed whatever critter was causing us so much trouble, I might be out of the extra pay. But at least I'd have my daytime life back. I crept up slowly, turning the flashlight off and sneaking stealthily towards the dark shape working away at the earth. I've hunted rabbits at night with my uncle before, so I figured I'd use the old flashlight technique that caused the animal to freeze for a second so I could take the killing shot. But when I did want to aim that powerful flashlight in direction of the digging thing, I almost cried out in fear. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a human crouched on all fours digging away at the earth with his or her bare hands. I couldn't bring myself to aim the rifle. I was too shocked at what I was looking at. So all I did was start making as much noise as possible, telling them to get out of there, saying I'd call the cops if they didn't comply. They complied, right, but not out of fear. The look in that person's eyes was one of fury, pure anger that they'd been interrupted in their obscene little act. I swear if I hadn't had that rifle with me, if I hadn't the means to defend myself that were obvious to them, I honestly don't know if I'd be here today to tell the story. Needless to say, the other workers didn't believe me and what I saw. Some of them told me they didn't doubt that I'd seen something, that they disputed what that thing was, and I get that, I really do. But still, I don't know what I saw. The police struggled to determine anything other than maybe a few boot footprints. But it really didn't lead to anything else, as that individual ran far, far into the tree line, beyond what I was capable of seeing. All I know is that it was definitely a person. For the longest time, I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia. It was only a summertime job for a 16-year-old. Nothing too crazy. Just cleaning off the grime and build up dirt from off of the tombstones and stuff. Now, to kind of set the scene a little, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 caretakers employed by the cemetery, in addition to one small simple mycelium. Other than that, it was all just flat earth with tombstones littering the entire site. The whole place felt pretty cut off to us. Surrounding the place were some of the densest forests in the entire state of Georgia. Naturally, because the eerie surroundings, I was always a little bit more paranoid than maybe I should have been, that, and I watch a ton of horror movies and such, which I get is a terrible combo for someone working in a cemetery. So one night I'm doing my rounds when I have to go into the small mausoleum. We had some of the wealthier families in the area and tuned within, and it was my job to go in. Make sure all was neat and clean. Making sure I met the standards of these uppity folks. I'm walking over to it, and right off the bat, I feel like something is off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, just this general sense that I wasn't alone. That's about the time that I noticed candle light coming from the small mycelium. I was also pretty certain that I could hear voices coming from inside, to like younger voices. Kids my age at the time. They were giggling and laughing, and it didn't sound particularly wholesome. Now, I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, but I also wasn't about to potentially take on a bunch of drunk teenagers on my own, as I definitely would have gotten my butt hooped. So I call the lone security officer on duty. The dude that does a few rounds on the lot. He was an older retired cop, but he was definitely tough, and I knew he jumped at the chance to help me out. When the ex-cop finally turns up, we both go inside. It was empty, which made absolutely no sense, as I'd literally just heard voices and stuff inside. There were indeed lit candles inside burning around one of the tombs, a tomb that had been opened up to reveal the remains of a child-sized skeleton. Nothing other than that was disturbed, but that was bad enough, mainly because the open tomb contained a rotten old child's doll, like the knitted kind. It was seriously disturbing to see that old thing smiling away whilst lying hand in hand with an actual kid skeleton. Me and the security guard quickly got out of there, doing a lightning sweep of the grounds to try to at least get eyes on the sick idiots that desecrated that girl's final resting place. Neither of us saw a soul, which was more frustrating than it was scary, and after about a quarter of an hour, We met back at the mausoleum to set the girl's grave in order by sliding the stone tablet back on top of the tomb. When we stepped inside, the doll that was previously hand in hand with the dead girl was sitting on the other side of the mausoleum, like just sat there upright with that same uneven smile stitched across her face. Whoever was messing with us had actually gone back to move that doll to taunt us. I quit the next day and never went back, not even to visit. Okay, so years ago, my dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weeding, tended to flower beds, etc. And aside from the occasional shadow seen out of the corner of my eye, are hearing strange sounds. The cemetery was actually quite a peaceful little place. But the strangeness is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 5 or 6 feet to expose a giant pair of stone slab doors. You pull the stone doors off and then drop down into a tiny cold dark room. These rooms can either fit to full-size coffins for children's coffins, by far the hardest to deal with, or years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would purchase one crypt and the entire family tree would be cremated and entered inside it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close it off, but others lit candles and leave mementos, flowers and souvenirs, pictures and stuff like that. It's really creepy opening up one of those things after like 50 plus years, and finding all kinds of melted candles and old pictures of the deceased people inside. Not only that, but when you hop down in there enough times, eventually you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. And that one day, inevitably, you're going to be joining them. Another time, my best friend and I were earning a little money over summer at the cemetery, working as groundskeepers when we were juniors and seniors. It was easy money. We got paid $5 an hour, mostly for edging or trimming, and generally keeping the whole place nice and tidy. We worked a lot of leaves and dug a lot of holes that summer. But we also got to tear around the grounds and what was basically a souped-up golf cart with our tools in the back. There was a lot of dead flowers to dig up, not to mention a lot of empty liquor bottles, beer cans, and unfortunately on occasion, even some used condoms. There was a widow who left scribbled notes on her husband's grave, almost all of them completely illegible. Also, a lot of sodden stuffed animals left on the graves of children. It felt so wrong throwing that stuff in the trash, and take my word on it that it sucked even harder than digging holes. It was annoying to work in the rain, and it rained often, but it was truly a gravy job. No pun intended. The creepiest thing I saw was one of the old-style baby dolls that had been left on a graveyard. Not inherently spooky, I know. But we'll keep the sounds, was the fact that was badly burned. Almost like someone had gone over it with a blowtorch or something. Not just that either. It had what we discovered to be these big iron nails that had been driven into the spaces. It should have been probably just some local college kids playing a prank or something. Heck, it could have been my buddy, but he never admitted to it. It just really creeped me out to see that thing one early morning when there wasn't another soul in sight. Having said that, there was something far, far worse I encountered while doing that job. It was the naked corpse of a young woman my age, left neatly with her arms at her sides, one foggy Saturday morning. She had been strangled right there. Whoever murdered her had also bludgeoned her horribly. She was identified quickly, and it turned out that she was a student at a neighboring high school, but her clothes were never found to my knowledge. Her murder was never ever solved. My friend and I were grilled by police on 2 separate occasions, and honestly, I think that was scariest part, knowing we were actually implicated in the murder, but we didn't know a thing, and each had alibis. So thankfully, we were eventually rolled out. And thankfully, the cops never bothered us anymore. I just pray that she's resting, and peace. My name is Sarah. I'm 20 years old, and I'm from North Carolina. Last November, exactly 101 years since the armistice of the Great War, my Penn State contemporary history class went to visit the Allied war graves over in France. I had never been out of the country before, not counting a small 2-day trip up to Canada to see a cousin of mine who was studying in Toronto. So I was extremely excited to see a little of the world outside of the east coast of the US. I even learned a little French to be able to get by taking a few online lessons on basic conversation and asking directions, lessons I worked super hard at too. With every little word that I learned every time I mastered the difficult pronunciations, I got a little bit more excited to the point where, when it was finally time to pack and drive out to the airport, I was positively shaking with anticipation. But when we arrived, it wasn't quite the Parisia and dream that I had envisioned. Aside from the weather being terrible, the French can be really, really rude to tourists, like unfathomably, so it made me realize how nice people can be in the US. Like sure we can get a few jerks that are all like speak English. This is America, but we certainly don't go around correcting minor mispronunciations, especially if it's a foreigner speaking English, which is exactly what some French people decided to do. I had asked directions to the nearest patisserie and end up getting a 10-minute grammar lesson from some sour old lady. And she was actually one of the less rude ones. The really mean French people simply ignored me altogether. Turned to say something like, "I'm sorry, no English," even though I just asked them a question in passable French. After a while, I got over how lame they were in. It helped that there were a lot of nice French people who made up for all the jokes. But I made up my mind to focus on the reason I was there in the first place, to enrich my knowledge of history with a plethora of physical visits and first-hand sources. So in a small quaint town called Suraj, and now, my class visited a war cemetery dedicated to American servicemen who died defending mainland Europe from the German Kaiser's brutal war machine. In was an American cemetery, the remains of over 6,000 fallen soldiers are interred in a series of plots labeled A to D under a blanket of iron-gray clouds. Our group walks silently among the rows of pristine white crucifixes, each one representing an American who had ventured to Europe on some great modern crusade but had not lived to tell the tale. I saw a man in uniform standing in a small patch of delicately pruned grass that showed no obvious markings of grave sites. This area was marked Plot 2. Plot 2 was not mapped on the plastic notice board that depicted the locations of the grave sites. There were no mentions of it in the visitor's guide. No mentions of it in the English-language pamphlets, nor any mention to it on the cemetery's website. It was as if the plot didn't exist at all. Officially, it didn't. As I walked solidly toward the uniformed man, I noticed his fatigues were of the old kind. The same olive drab that was worn during the Second World War. I figured he must have been some kind of tour guide or reenactor or something. Then I began to see them all of the 96 white markers the size of index cards, carrying only a small ID number, no name, no place of birth, just simple little ID numbers that made them appear more like a subterranean filing cabinets more than anything else. Unlike the other plots, that were no stars and stripes flying, no indication that these were Americans, and all it was terribly sad, and I wondered why there was a complete lack of reverence to those grapes. But I didn't have to wait long to find out. The buried with her backs facing the other plots, the man solemnly said, "But here, apart from the others, lie the dishonorable dead." He smirked at the look of confusion on my face. U.S. soldiers who happened to be dishonorably discharged by the military before their execution for either assault or murder of European civilians. "Oh, I see, and whose grave is this one?" I quietly pointed down to the small white plaque at his feet. "This one," he smiled, but he couldn't hide the melancholic look in his gray eyes. "This one belongs to a criminally inclined soldier who happened to be caught poaching on some rich English aristocrat's country estate. They were caught in argument to sued, and the landowner received a single gunshot wound to the head. The murder was Pennsylvania man, his name, Georgie Smith. They realized like Corporal Clark in Private Guerra over there," he said, gesturing to a pair of the small white markers, "who savagely assaulted and strangled a 15-year-old girl while based in the UK, or Lewis Till, a black soldier executed for his alleged involvement in the murder of an Italian woman." Lewis Till, sir. The name seems so familiar, but for all the wrong reasons. That's right. Its father hanged on foreign shores while his son was just 3 years old, a dark foreshadowing of his own death just 11 years later. I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was the very same Emmett Till whose mother gave him that open casket funeral to show the world how terribly her son had been treated in his final moments. How might she have felt knowing she lost her husband and son in the exact same way? A false accusation jumped upon which such violent zeal that her loved ones were taken away within moments of their supposed transgressions. How could she have coped with that? How could anyone have coped with that? He was exactly how the guy had phrased it. A foreshadowing, like Emmett's death had been decided many years before his fate entwined with that of his father's in the most hideous way possible. It's the most intensely creepy fact I've ever had to come to terms with. One that made me question my entire worldview, to wonder if there really is some sort of plan, God's plan, the devil's whatever. For some people, maybe just maybe there are people out there that really are just doomed.